Instantly contesting the center, this pawn boldly opens diagonals for both queen and bishop, setting the stage for dynamic play. Embracing a more solid, defensive posture, this prepares for central pawn advances later, sacrificing initial attacking initiative for long-term stability. Establishing central dominance, this pawn thrust immediately challenges black's limited space and sets the stage for a battle of mobility. Opening the center with this pawn thrust immediately challenges white's central pawn, inviting sharp tactical skirmishes and demanding precise piece coordination. Developing the knight here subtly prepares an eventual c3 pawn push, reinforcing the center while keeping options open for the queen's bishop. Challenging the center, black aims to dismantle white's pawn structure and open lines for active piece play. Developing the knight to its natural outpost, this move prepares castling while maintaining flexibility for the pawn structure. Accepting the gambit opens critical central diagonals, posing immediate tactical questions for white's knights. Opening the e-file now grants immediate central influence and forces black's pawn structure into a more defined shape. Recapturing with the queen immediately loosens your pawn structure and exposes your monarch to potential early attacks. Focusing the bishop onto the queen forces a decision, creating immediate tactical geometry where the queen must find safety or risk being a target, potentially opening lines for attack. Seeking refuge, the queen steers clear of the bishop's aggressive gaze, aiming to redeploy and potentially support a central pawn advance, though it momentarily relinquishes some initiative and risks getting cramped. Castling finally secures the king behind a pawn wall, initiating white's long-term development and preparing for potential kingside play while avoiding premature central conflict. Developing the knight to its natural outpost on c6 efficiently pressures white's d4 pawn and prepares to contest the center, a crucial aspect in this dynamic French defense structure. Recapturing that pawn and immediately bringing the rook to the central file aims to exploit black's slightly uncoordinated pieces, creating immediate pressure on the d5 pawn and opening lines for potential future attacks. Developing the knight to its natural square, the horse now eyes the weakened central pawn structure and prepares to join the queenside pawn fight. The knight's redeployment to the b3 square is a shrewd maneuver, aiming to bolster the queenside pawns and potentially join the attack by swinging over to the c5 or d4 squares, creating a more dynamic pawn structure in the center. Undermining white's knight on b3 with a timely pawn advance, black seeks to create structural advantages and potentially open lines for counterplay. Securing the queenside expansion with b4 becomes a distinct possibility now, while simultaneously preventing b5 and reinforcing the d4 pawn's dominion. A measured development, this bishop now anchors the kingside defense and prepares to join the central struggle, subtly challenging white's central pawn structure. Unleashing the knight from its cozy d2 square, this advance aims to disrupt black's bishop development and potentially create immediate tactical complications by eyeing both the d6 queen and the undefended f7 pawn. It's a bold injection of activity, seeking to exploit any hesitations in black's setup and seizing the initiative rather than passively allowing black to consolidate. The knight's repositioning, after a pawn sacrifice, decisively opens a crucial diagonal for your queen, potentially threatening kingside pressure and disrupting white's pawn structure. Reclaiming the central pawn with the knight immediately resolves the tension of the captured d pawn, reintegrating a key piece into the fight for the center while simultaneously preparing to contest the d-file. Securing the monarch within the castle walls is a prudent step, bringing the king to relative safety while preparing for potential middle-game skirmishes. Solidifying the central pawns while preparing for potential pawn expansion on the queenside is the idea behind bringing the b-pawn forward. Positioning the rook to the open file offers immediate central influence and prepares for potential pawn advancements on the queenside later. Shifting the bishop to b2 readies it to support a potential kingside expansion later, while also subtly preparing to exploit the now open long diagonal should the center ever fully unlock. Challenging the center and reclaiming initiative, Black's queen boldly advances, forcing white to reconsider their rook lift and potentially disrupting the pawn's structure. Instantly activating the queen on the d3 square seeks to exploit the slight disarray in black's kingside defense, eyeing the f7 square as a potential target, while simultaneously reinforcing white's central pawn structure and preparing for a potential queenside expansion later. A prudent retreat, reinforcing the king's safety by creating an escape square, while implicitly acknowledging white's growing central pressure and the potential for tactical fireworks on the kingside if the pawn structure remained static. Preventing potential dark square weaknesses around white's monarch is the immediate concern, though this pawn push subtly concedes a slight spatial advantage in the center, potentially allowing black's pieces to gain more influence on the d-file. Shifting the queen to c7 offers a better retreat square should the bishop on b2 advance, while also preparing to potentially eye the queenside via the c-file if it opens. Shifting the queen to e2 aims to alleviate immediate pressure on the d-file and prepares for potential pawn pushes like f4, reinforcing white's central presence and offering the queen a more secure retreat should black's pieces converge aggressively. Black injects immediate activity into the queenside by developing the bishop to an aggressive outpost, challenging white's control and preparing to exploit the open c-file once that pawn advances. Centralizing the rook clears the d-file for immediate pressure and prepares to contest it should black dare to bring their own rook over, while also allowing the knight on b3 potential access to c5 or d4 depending on the subsequent pawn structure. Black solidifies the kingside, preparing to redeploy the bishop and potentially contest the open d-file, a move that subtly tightens defensive lines while subtly eyeing future active piece play. Shifting the rook to the d-file aims to contest control and potentially pressure black's central pawn structure, a subtle but important maneuver in this dynamically balanced position. Challenging the center with pawn thrusts is a recurring theme, and here black boldly seizes initiative by striking at the heart of white's position. This pawn advance not only disrupts white's harmonious piece development, but also opens vital diagonals for black's bishops, hinting at future aggressive intentions. It's a declaration of intent, seeking to unravel white's somewhat passive structure and create dynamic counterplay. Reuniting the knights allows white to potentially reroute the f3 knight to a more active square, perhaps g5 or even e5 if the opportunity arises, while also offering better protection for the d4 pawn and preparing for a pawn push on the kingside if black isn't careful. The pawn's advance to e4 injects immediate dynamism, challenging white's central grip and potentially opening lines for black's pieces, notably the queen, which has been somewhat confined. This pawn push initiates a tactical skirmish, forcing white to make a decision regarding the pawn structure and potentially creating weaknesses in the process. Whether this liberates black's position or overextends them remains to be seen, but it undeniably shifts the game's character towards a more aggressive, active phase. Exchanging the bishop for the knight seizes control of the weakened dark squares around black's monarch, creating long-term structural imbalances. Confronting the immediate threat to the queen, this capture not only frees the bishop but also seizes the initiative on the d-file, potentially opening lines for further pressure against white's castled king. A swift recapture of a piece, opening the door to new tactical possibilities and seizing control of the diagonal previously occupied by the bishop. Black recaptures the bishop, a natural response, but surrenders the crucial diagonal that protected their monarch, opening a dangerous path for white's rook to menace the kingside. Sacrificing material to forcibly open the b-file for your rook, aiming for overwhelming pressure along the now cleared horizontal, while simultaneously accepting a slight positional concession by pushing your pawns into a slightly awkward configuration. Black finally consolidates their material advantage, recognizing that white's king is exposed and the remaining pieces are poorly coordinated after the bishop's sacrifice. The queenside pawns, while doubled, are now on their way to becoming an unstoppable force, particularly the passed pawn on the c-file, which can be supported by the queen and rook. This infusion of material is the defining feature of the emerging endgame. The bishop's repositioning now seizes control of a crucial diagonal, a classic demonstration of how to exploit an opponent's exposed king, even in this seemingly drawn position. Finally, black embraces the e-file, a bold decision aiming to activate the rooks and challenge white's entrenched bishop on b6 by opening lines for counterplay. The knight's redeployment to e1 appears to be a pragmatic retreat, abandoning the advanced square after the opponent's bold pawn push, aiming to regroup and defend against further incursions rather than immediately seeking counterplay. Exploiting the knight's awkward placement, black aims to disrupt white's rook battery and recover material by targeting that isolated bishop.